Jenny and Shirley. I'd like to start perhaps if you'd like to introduce yourselves so that our audience know who we're talking to today.
Right, okay. I'm Jenny Dugmore. I'm chair of the International Standards Group that is responsible for developing the 20,000 series, and obviously recently part 1 just been published as a second edition. I'm also involved at national level, and I am actually, as my day job, a service management consultant. My background does include operational management of service management as well.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Shirley?
So I also, like Jenny, specialise in service management. We do both consulting and training. I've been involved in the development of BS 15000, as it was before it became ISO 20000. And I've also been involved in the development of ITIL, both as an author and more recently as a project mentor for the ITIL update.
Okay, excellent, thank you very much. Now, what we wanted to talk about today were a number of different things. And first of all, I'd like to start by understanding why service management, why IT service management, what's important about it?
I think if you look at the way we all live, the way industry and businesses operate, they're all hugely dependent on technology-based service, just everyday life, hugely. And what 20,000 actually does is define the set of basic rules for how you deliver a really effective service that understands and meets business needs.
Okay.
And that's fundamentally what it does in not very many pages, condenses all the key points.
Okay. And Shirley, could you perhaps give us some examples of...
Yes, certainly. I think a common example we use, because we do training as well in service management, one that people really understand is actually mobile phones. So you go and buy a mobile phone, but actually when you're using it, you need to be able to make a phone call or connect to the internet to actually download data information that you need. So you're not just buying the product, you're buying a whole service behind it. And when you make a support call from wherever you are in the world, you actually want a good response. You want somebody who can actually understand your technology and fix the problem. You don't want to wait 2 hours, 2 days, 3 days. I think the other major thing there is for any service provider is that actually they don't have a major outage, and that's so serious for their reputation. And obviously their customers at the very basic level want the service to work.
Okay. Jenny, do you have another example to add?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is there are just so many examples because so many services are based on technology. So it ranges from things that are life-threatening unless they work, like ambulance services, the way hospitals function, through to whether or not we can get cash out of a machine when we need it. The transport system, everything is just service-based and requires technology. And the nature of 20,000 is that it's actually independent of the technology. But we've all got examples of where we've had a very bad service. And the nature of it, as Shirley was saying, it's not just making certain if something goes wrong it's fixed very quickly, it's stopping it going wrong in the first place. And that's the fundamental thing about 20,000. It actually avoids and manages risks to a service and therefore to business activities.
Okay, thank you. So coming on to ISO 20000, Shirley, ISO 20000 is the standard for IT service management. It specifically talks about IT, so is it an IT standard?
Well, it's developed by the IT group at the international level for the information technology groups. But I think the really important thing is that really many services are just technology enabled. So really when you look at it, there are not many services where ISO 20000 doesn't apply. And I think it can be used by the business parts of an organisation that are using technology services and also IT departments where they really need to demonstrate and work with their customers to deliver better service. I think a key thing with 20,000 is that it establishes a culture of continual service improvement. And as much as anything, it's actually changing to better ways of working so that actually you are reducing those risks and delivering more value for your actual customers.
So, Jenny, just talking about the history and the background of,
Mm.
ISO 20000, you've been involved with the standard for a number of years.
Mm.
How do you think it's developed and moved on over time?
I think it's actually developed and in some cases led improved thinking about how you deliver service, how you do really effective service management. I know in the early days we were still feeling our way about the best way to set the rules for good practice. Certainly at national level we produced a standard that worked very well for native English speakers, and then going to international level we filled a huge gap in the range of standards because there was nothing equivalent in place already. If you look at the cost of technology, 80% is keeping it running, and that's the area where 20,000 fits. So we actually filled a huge gap in the range of standards. We'd produced something that was worded by native English speakers for a native English speaking audience without even realising we were doing it. We went international and discovered there were some quite fascinating areas where you can actually confuse people who are possibly mentally translating into their own language. So a lot of what we've actually done over the last few years is making certain that we have a consistent language, that we have language that can be translated consistently, so it can be translated just as well into Spanish as into Japanese. English by its nature has got many, many words, and more than any other language. And we have to be particularly careful that where we are using one word, it does get translated consistently, and that's been a major focus of it. There have been other areas of work as well, because service management thinking has progressed over that time as well.
Okay. Shirley, I understand that the international standard has quite a close relationship with ITIL.
Yes.
So would you perhaps like to explain that?
Yes, so ITIL really is best practice for service management. So it's used by 150 countries worldwide, where people are taking qualifications in ITIL, so that's fairly easy to track and understand. And that's quite a big community. So ITIL actually provides both best practice for people to understand how they apply service management, how you implement something like an incident management process, a change management process. What should you actually do? What is best practice to achieve then the requirements in ISO 20000? And I think that's really important, that they've actually got that guidance that they need. And people are trained in ITIL as well. So it's a professional qualification. It becomes a whole service management professional body of knowledge that people use to actually achieve 20,000. And I think that's the success of both ITIL and 20,000, that the two work together. So organisations will use ITIL to change their organisation to what we call a service-oriented organisation, and rather than being technology-focused. And then they can actually demonstrate that and prove that they've achieved a best practice level, that they've achieved a culture of continual service improvement by actually being certified against 20,000, or even just being assessed against 20,000. So the two together work really well hand in hand.
And what would you say to perhaps an organisation that's currently using ITIL but perhaps hasn't looked at ISO 20000?
I think it's becoming increasingly important, particularly for some organisations that are going global. As Jenny said, that the international language now, it's all done for you, the language. So adoption worldwide is a really important aspect. And obviously with 20,000, you then have access to all the international certification and audit bodies. So there's a mechanism all there to actually do audits. And in terms of reducing risk, organisations do struggle with the complexity of delivering services across the globe. And I think increasingly are interested in it because of that. And that whole infrastructure is there to do all of that. So I think it is becoming increasingly important. Also very important, I think, for technology-based companies like web-based service companies. They're just starting up now, probably very similar to what we saw in the 90s. They're growing, and when those companies grow, they need to actually adopt best practice and prove that they have it. So I think, it's increasingly important in an international arena.
Excellent. So perhaps if we talk a little bit about implementing the standard, because standards are a wonderful document to read, but in terms of actually using it, so I think one of the things I'd be keen to hear from both of you is, what would you say if somebody was sitting down and starting to look at ISO 20000, what would be the first thing that you would advise them to do?
In my case, it would be for them to have an understanding of the benefits of doing it, because you do need sometimes to explain to people it's not an overhead. The virtue of 20,000, if you fulfil it, you are delivering a better service for less money, because you are inherently more efficient. And one of the things about the history of it's been based on the practical experience of service management, it's not an abstract standard. If you comply with them, you are fixing your problems faster, but you're stopping problems occurring. And if you look at even basic calculations, that can take major percentages out, the unit costs of doing certain activities. Activities become repeatable, they become less prone to errors. By being predictable, other people then know how they can interact with it. So the message is, how much are we going to save by adopting 20,000? How much better is the service going to be? And it's a double whammy. You get both. Better service, cheaper. It's not an overhead. So you've actually got to put that in your context. And in some places, it might be, we will save so many more lives because we'll be so much more efficient. In other, it will be, we will keep our customers because they will really like what we're doing. In some organisations, it's, we are just going to have a much cheaper IT service. And those parameters, people lose sight. They think it's an overhead, and it most certainly isn't.
Okay, so we've been talking about implementing ISO 20000, and Jenny just shared with us how the first thing that she would suggest to somebody who's picking up the standard to start from new. Shirley, would you have something that you would add to that? What was the first thing you would suggest somebody
Well,
did?
I think actually following on from that, the first thing that organisations really would benefit from is really doing an assessment against 20,000 as it is. And in reality, you've got to understand how far away you are from achieving the standard. And I think generally speaking, many people are very pleasantly surprised by how far they actually already are on their journey. So it's actually really helps you to understand. So we originally designed 20,000 so that organisations could really achieve it within 2 years. Now that's if you really apply all the parts of it and you're actually determined to achieve 20,000 and that standard. So if you really understand from day one where you are on that 2-year journey, then it's really useful, you know what the rest of the journey is. If you're already 6 months into it, then you can plan for the 18 months. So I think that's practical advice, really.
Okay, excellent, thank
people.
you. So we've talked about the first things you would suggest. Jenny, what would you see as a big challenge that organisations face, or the biggest thing you'd want to warn somebody about?
I think one of the things I'd suggest is people have to be careful that they, or two related things, that they understand what to do first, because it's quite important that you actually keep the momentum going by doing, if you do need to do improvements, improving something where it's going to be visible that there is a real improvement, quite short term. A quick win type of approach, because it gives people confidence that it's worthwhile going to the next step, because for some organisations some of the steps are very necessary but not necessarily very easy. And the other thing is to make certain that what you put in place is completely integrated. It's very easy to have one process operating very effectively but operating in isolation. And the virtue of service management is that all the activities are working closely together, so it's like a machine where all the parts fit. Trying to do it in isolation doesn't work.
Okay. Shirley, what would you add to that in terms of a big
I think one of the things we
challenge?
find varies between different organisations is the level of management commitment. So you actually have many examples where people they actually come up quite often and do an ITIL course, and then they come back and they start improving their area. and then another team comes in and starts to improve their area, and it becomes an uncoordinated improvement programme. And really what 20,000, you really need the commitment of the management team and the senior management team to actually lead the implementation. That's by far the best approach. You need everybody involved, obviously. So it's really probably the challenge is the people side and actually getting that management commitment top to bottom.
Excellent, thank you both. Looking now, obviously one of the main reasons that we decided to sit down and chat was because there's been a transition, a publication of a revision of the standard. So just looking at the what's changed. So Jenny, would you perhaps like to sort of explain what's changed between the version of the standard that was published in 2005 and the version of the standard that's been published in 2011?
Yeah. The main differences I've mentioned already, the language is much more suitable for an international audience, much more consistent. We have a style guide where certain words are the words you use in a certain context, certain words are forbidden, so we don't use address because that translates differently and it's used differently by different English-speaking countries. As far as the more substantive changes to the standard, the kind of changes we've done is it's much more explicit about how you manage a supply chain. So no service provider does absolutely everything themselves. They always rely on other suppliers, maybe internal groups in their organisation that they don't have direct control of. Some people have complex supply chains where the customers are actually doing part of the work. So, for example, you might have a specialist business group contributing to the overall service. We've actually introduced a set of requirements that covers that eventuality, which is the reality that most people find themselves in. And actually that means that there are organisations who perhaps were unable to achieve all the requirements for 20,000 in the past, now will become eligible because they can actually prove that they are managing their suppliers, they're managing their relationships in the way that 20,000 requires. And the other big change is that in early days of service management, it was almost like a wall between service management and development projects, and projects would just suddenly appear on the service management side of the wall, and sometimes you knew nothing about it until you got lots of calls to a help desk. What we did with the first edition of 20,000, we moved a little way into projects that are changing the way a service will work, new applications, maybe just major changes to the service environment. We've moved that further up. So in effect, now service management gets involved in the first stages of a major change to the service, even if that is being done by another organisation. So it's an advance in the intellect behind service management that's now reflected in 20,000. Other changes are much more minor. They are refinements, slight improvements, possibly some additional requirements that apply at process level.
Okay, thank you. Shirley, just moving from that point, what does that mean for organisations? What should they be doing? How should they be tackling it?
Well, I actually go back to the previous point. Actually, they need to assess where they are against it. So we've got one customer who's achieved 20,000. They also use ITIL. So actually, ITIL was updated in 2007 and has recently had a consistency update in 2011. But at both of those, so 2007 very much went to a service life cycle view. So we have service design, service transition and service operation with service strategy and continual service improvement. That really goes together with the new edition of 20,000, where the clause in there is about the design and transition of new and changed services. So very much aligned. So that's an area where certainly our customer is focused on. And they'd already adopted it as best practices, but now actually the standard supports them actually doing that much better. And it is an area that they struggled with. So really they're actually looking at the things that have changed. So they would look at those key areas. They're probably already doing some of them. So people shouldn't feel that they're not doing those things that are in 20,000. So again, really understand what you're doing that's okay, and then understand what you have to do to add to it.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Now, you've co-authored 2 books around the subjects. So I guess my first question really is why? Why write a book when you spent all the time writing the standard? Why write a book about it?
I suppose there's a whole series of explanations for it. Particularly part 1, it's a set of rules, and rules in isolation can be quite difficult to understand. They have to be written in certain ways so that they can be translated consistently. And this is the whys. Why would you do it this way? If you do it that way, why does it go wrong? So it's the practical experience, and the analogy Shirley's used, it's like a recipe. Part 1 is the ingredients. You can only go so far in international documents, but the book is basically, this is how you mix the ingredients. And maybe it's a bit like self-assembly furniture. Part 1 is a whole series of components, and we all know how difficult they are to put together, even with instructions, but the books provide you with a very easy guide to understand how all these bits fit together.
So, Shirley, what do you think are the key things that a reader will be able to get from looking at the books?
I think as much as anything is if you have a gap against the standard, then it's actually, people go through that thing, well, how do I do it? And that's really generally what people want. They want some confidence in as to what they're going to do will actually work. So they need to understand what the gap is. And this is just human nature, isn't it, really? You have to understand, what have I got to do? I've never seen it before, what have I got to do? And I think you can do the wrong thing very often, invest an amount of money or time. And people don't have time, actually, people that are delivering services anymore, because of the cuts in the last few years. They're very short of their own time. They want the quick way to understand it and then do the right thing the first time. So they want to be certain they are doing the right thing. And I think the easy-to-read books really help people. They can pick it up, read it on the train. It's not too difficult to do. Read it in the office quickly. Read the page that means something to them. And I don't think from that perspective books will ever go away. A lot of people find them very useful.
So, in terms of the books themselves, who would you suggest should be reading them?
Again, a very broad base of readers. People who have some understanding of service management, but actually want to know how it all fits together. The practical examples, so that basically anyone who needs to understand the practical issues around making service management work really well. So senior operational manager, people responsible for a particular process in service management, people with operational line management in a service provider's organisation, people who do internal audits, external audits, and even customers who are maybe frustrated because they're not getting the service they want. And even regrettably, there are still many customers who are forced to understand the language of their service provider, and that will actually help them understand. It will actually help them articulate what they actually do want in the way of a service as well. So again, a very broad base.
Shirley, in terms of the readership and the books, how else do you think they will help people move forward in using the standards?
Well, I'd like to pick up on Jenny's point, really, about customers and their use of it, really. Because certainly in my experience, having an easy-to-use and read book, I've actually used it with clients where they are frustrated by their service provider. They can actually read things like this Service Manager's Guide, and they suddenly understand what's happening on the other side. And then they start to have a far better exchange with the service provider. Now that's really what you want. You want both sides talking to each other, understanding each other. So I think that increased understanding is how people can use it. but I think it's also in an area. I mean, one of the hard areas is how do you actually do governance of processes operated by other parties, and who does that mean? Who should I be looking at? Should I be worried about that or not? What is the gap? And I think in those kind of areas there's really some useful advice in there with examples which are also very useful for people. So I think it depends what your gap is, what your problem is, what you're worried about. But it is the kind of thing you can read probably from cover to cover if you want the overview. If you're a process owner, you can actually go in and read that section about your own processes. If you're in a senior management team, you probably need an oversight of the book, but you would actually focus on some of the key chapters in there.
Okay, fantastic. Just really for just to wrap things up, perhaps any final comments from either of you, and anything else that you'd like to share that you think people using the standard or looking to use the standard would find valuable?
I think if we shouldn't lose sight of just the importance of the subject area that the standard covers, because it is so much a part of everybody's life that we're all reliant on technology-enabled services. We are all immensely frustrated and annoyed when a service goes wrong, and what the standard does is move organisations and services into a much more robust and more cost-effective position. You can actually make huge differences. One of the analogies I use, and I don't like going to the dentist. When I'm due to go to the dentist, I clean my teeth very carefully for a while beforehand. And I think what the standard does, particularly if you go for certification, it sets expectations that you will not only reach a very effective way of delivering the service, but you will sustain it. And it's sustaining it that is often the issue, and that's where certification comes in, because you're actually checked at regular intervals. So it's a bit like having regular dental appointments, and hopefully people don't just do all the work in the last 2 weeks, but it's an opportunity, not a threat. It's an opportunity to make certain you stay as good as you can be indefinitely, even if other things are changing. And it's actually a lot more practical than a new reader might actually appreciate, because it's on this huge infrastructure of very practical experience, the concentration of that.
Excellent, thank you. Shirley, what would you add to that?
I think really that it actually works in practice. Certainly with our customers, it is like they do go through these over a 3-year cycle when you're actually audited again. You've got the surveillance audits in between, but then the major audit comes, and it comes really just in time when potentially you're starting to get, you need to have a more thorough cleaning of your team. But I think that's really important because it does give that sustainability. But also, I think it's also an opportunity to reinvigorate everybody's interest in it, and to really look at how they get improvement. That you're not just doing it for the sake of doing it. So although you're meant to have that continual service improvement, there is a cycle in there that goes on that I think actually really works in practice. So not only was it developed by practitioners doing it in practice, it actually works in practice. And there's many organisations that have got a huge benefit from it. And one of the benefits that I really like is, as well as the kind of cost reduction and more effective and continual improvement, is actually that you can get change in faster. And that's what organisations really want to do today. Their business models are changing around the world as many organisations go global. And how do you get that change in, both into the business and into the technology service provider? It's hard. So how do we do it better? We've got to get better at doing that. And it really helps with that as well.
Fantastic, thank you.